Okay, Margot, whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks, Mariel. Hi, everyone. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. Thanks for joining us for the ACRL Presents webcast, Open Data Repositories, Creating Equitable and Sustainable Data Access, offered today as part of Open Access Week. As a reminder, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording link shortly after today's session. Our presenters today are Abigail Gobin and Robert Sandusky. Abigail is an associate professor and information services librarian at the University of Illinois at Chicago Library of Health Sciences. Her research focuses on research data policies in education, as well as student perceptions of library learning analytics. Abigail is an active member of LIDA and ACRL and serves as a presenter and coordinator for the ACRL Research Data Management Roadshow. Robert is an associate professor and associate dean for information technology at the University of Illinois at Chicago Library. His research focuses on the translatability of notions of computational provenance as embodied in the W3C's Prov recommendations to libraries, archives, and museums, as well as understanding and supporting data management as a co-investigator for the NSF-funded DataOne project. Thanks again for joining us for today's session. And Abigail and Robert, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Margot. And just a reminder, today is being recorded, so there will be a recording of this presentation. So as I said, I'm Abigail Gobin, and joining me is Dr. Robert Sandusky, and we're both from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where it is a gorgeous fall day today. So the things that we're going to take a look at today, I'm going to start with a bit about the data repository landscape, where it is that we are at the moment, and then we'll talk a bit about researcher challenges and what they are continuing to face with data repositories, and then the questions that are coming up around sustainability and also equity. And then Bob's going to talk about the DataOne model and the sustainability efforts and challenges that they are undertaking. Are the slides advancing okay? Can someone let me know if slides are advancing all right? They are not. Okay, Margot, can you help with, and sound is coming through apparently. All right. All right, before we get too far into it, always want to check that. Okay, so let's start with the current landscape of data repositories, now that we have slides working. I want to talk about data repository categories in kind of four broad areas that are cropping up in different ways, and they have had different obligations, but they're all coalescing, and they're all those data repositories that everyone is trying to tackle. So we'll look at organization, publisher or journal, disciplinary, and then miscellaneous. So let's start with organization. And these are ones that are very familiar. We've seen these happening for a while. They're ones that we're starting to really rely on. These could be, the way that I'm defining this is kind of the organization being the government or a large body like a government level one. I have the World Health Organization here. Or they might be organizational ones that are institutional. And we've seen a lot of traction with these at the government level over time around certain kinds of data. So the World Health Organization has the Global Cancer Observatory. The USGS has tons and tons of data. Geoscience is way ahead of all of the rest of us because they have to be in order to preserve that geodata that we can only gather once. And one of the interesting trends that we've seen is city data portals, where we're starting to see cities really embrace data repositories. Chicago is one of them. We have a very robust data portal. Boston, Austin, LA, we're starting to see these all come on board. I think the most interesting data set for Chicago is the salary data set. They put out all the city employees and tell you what everybody makes, and that's always something somebody wants to look up and play with. On the institutional side, we're very used to thinking about repositories in terms of scholarly articles. It's Open Access Week. We've been doing scholarly articles for a long time. The move to data repositories hasn't come quite as quickly, and we're still learning how to wrangle data in a different way. But there are some examples that we can look at. Probably the oldest is PER from Purdue University, where they give each of their researchers, I believe it's 10 or 20 gigs, and they're like, put stuff here, figure it out. And they were kind of the first ones on the scene. Very recently, Iowa State University has spun up DataShare, which is built on a Figshare backend. So they're just getting started with their data repository. And the University of California system has Merit, which is also their institutional repository for some of their sites, but then can work as a data repository across UC. We're also seeing a lot of change right now in terms of journals and publishers with the OSTP mandate from 2013 that said, sort out what happens to your data, and the National Science Foundation data management plans. Everybody started to say, okay, well, at point of publication, we may also need that data. We may need to figure out what's going on with the data so that it doesn't get lost. And publishers and journals are starting to step into that gap where institutions may not be able to. Some of the solutions we've seen, Elsevier purchased Mendeley, and they're using that as a data repository, so you can submit there. It is discipline agnostic. In the last year, Springer Nature spun up data services. Now, right now, they're not pushing to their own data repository. They're pushing to other repositories. And in the data community, we're really encouraging them to push back to the institutional repositories because we have the infrastructure and the support network that the researchers need. You may also see that various journals have a link to a data repository or have a data repository just for their journal. If you take a look at the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communications, they have a Harvard Dataverse instance. So when I published an article there, we submitted our data, and it's linked right at the bottom of our article, and the data is there. And I think that gets more use, actually, than the article does. But usually these are tied to Harvard Dataverse and Data Dryad. You'll see them as agnostic data repositories, but they're tied to something. So you'll see them tied at that journal level. We're also seeing an increase in disciplinary repositories. Earth sciences and paleobiology are kind of leading the way on this. I just learned about bugguide.net last week. It is amazing. If you have any interest in insects, you should check out BugGuide. It's all these pictures and everything is structured and you can see when things hatch, and it's just absolutely incredible. If, on the other hand, you like birds, you should check out eBird, and it's building on community science, not just researchers participating. Another really fun one is the paleobiology database. I found out that you can look up and see where all the mammoths are in the Midwest, where they've dug all of them up. So there's a lot of these disciplinary repositories, and this is becoming a bigger question within different disciplines. If they're going to build a data repository and put their data together so they can do bigger projects, and if they're going to do that, who builds that infrastructure? Who provides that infrastructure? Is it an institution? Is it the government? Is it a publisher? And what are the repercussions for each of those? And then finally, we have that other data as assigned. OSF, the Open Science Framework, Figshare, and Zenodo all are not necessarily tied to one of these other areas. They're not tied to a university, but they can be. They're not tied to a discipline, but they could be. So you can use them without affiliation, without being in a particular group. You could just say, okay, here's the data, and they have that space, and you can put it there. On one hand, that's really great. It gives people a lot of options. On the other, we also know that non-curated collections tend to get a little eclectic and may or may not be as useful. So with any of these four, there's always a question of discovery. You've put the data up there. That's nice. How do people actually find the data? How can they know that it's there so that they don't need to recreate it? So if you want to go look at all those mammoths, you know about paleobiology, or you want some birds, you can get to eBird. One of the best known ways that you can do this is Re3Data. This has been a joint effort across the United States and also out of Europe, and it is a registry of data repositories. I know Michael Witt from Purdue worked on it for a while. There's been a lot of engagement, and it continues to be updated by the data community. And it's a really great place to start. If you have a student who says, I want to know if there's data on X, you can say, well, okay, let's go see what the ornithology repositories are, and then we can get down to eBird. If you're looking for government data, data.gov spun up a few years ago, and it's a little clunkier to navigate, but it does get you into federal government data, and there's so much data floating around in there. So it's a good starting point to start to find data sets from the U.S. government. Most recently, and the one I have the least experience with, is the Google Dataset Search. And Google is kind of building a layer on top of what has come before. It feels much like Google Scholar, where other people had done indexing, other people had done work to make sure this infrastructure was in place, and they're doing that overarching search. I'm still not entirely clear. I've read a few of the articles, I've played around with it a little bit, and they're doing some things with it, but I'm not sure what. So do go and, it's still in beta. You should go and play with it and take a look at it. What I found is it's also finding what Re3Data finds. It's also finding what data.gov finds. But we know our researchers are going to use it. So you want to be familiar with it. You want to have an idea. It may or may not come out of beta. They may or may not charge for something in the future. We'll all find out. So that's kind of the landscape at the moment. Let's step back now and take a look at the researcher perspective. What are their concerns as they're thinking about data repositories? And I'll limit today to just really talking about the researcher perspective. We could also, though, talk about this as the user perspective, as a student perspective, someone who is looking for this from an educational perspective, because that is a huge use of data. But today we're just going to focus on the researchers. And we have a lot of challenges and opportunities. And all of these could fit into either category, but I grouped challenges to the left, and I kind of grouped opportunities to the right. So everyone right now is trying to sort out compliance. What does my funder say I have to do? What does my journal say I have to do? And how do I meet that requirement? What do they actually want? This is an ongoing problem that everyone, the answer is a little bit different every single time. So we're still all trying to navigate that compliance. Right now, there are few traditional rewards, and we're not seeing data being cited the same way that we see papers still being cited. We're not seeing data sets as given equal weight in a promotion and tenure case. I think this is something that is coming. I think another 5 or 10 years, and we will be seeing this. But right now, those traditional rewards, in a lot of fields, there's still a mindset or a question of, okay, you got the data, but what did you do with it? Did you write and publish a paper? So the data, the underlying data is not valued yet. Everyone is struggling with security and privacy. No one has sorted out how we best de-identify things. We're all struggling with that. That is going to be an ongoing issue until we're not doing human subject research anymore. And then there's the question of evaluating reuse and reusability. And this is really where I think librarians have a deep understanding of the challenges, because it is collection development. We know that not every book that we buy, no matter how wonderful it is, it may just sit on the shelf. It may not go anywhere. But it also may be assigned for a class next month and then get used all the time. We know there are challenges with trying to identify and becoming an expert in saying, this is a data set we should keep, that we should preserve and make sure it's accessible and available, and this other data set, maybe not. And I think we're still figuring out a lot of those things. We still are sorting it out for books, so I don't think this is going to be an easily solved problem. Some of the opportunities ahead, though, are discovery and collaboration. I just finished a course where I made students work interdisciplinarily and propose research ideas around where they had to use data from each of their fields. And as research becomes more interdisciplinary, it's fascinating to see how different data sets from different fields can be used together, can answer new questions in ways we hadn't thought about. Sharing your data does lead to enhanced reputation. If someone can go back and say, oh, no, that is actually what the data says, or they can reproduce it, now you're known as a good collaborator and someone who shares. Data is becoming a scholarly object. We're starting to see that valuation of it as a separate individual line, not just the thing that supports your CV and your publications. And also, we want to keep data so that we're preventing retractions. I love reading Retraction Watch. It's probably my best and favorite soap opera. And most of what I see on there is we couldn't find the data. When we went back to the data, it wasn't right, it was corrupted, and they have to retract a paper, and you've damaged that reputation so much. So turning the lens a little bit to sustainability and equity. I was debating if I put the implausibility of sustainability rather than the plausibility, because there are a lot of challenges ahead for us. Some of those are the threats, that standard triple threat: funding, time, and personnel. We never have enough people, we never have enough time, we never have enough money. And with data repositories, this is writ large. Bug Guide that I talked about earlier is one person. There's one person keeping that really rolling. There's a huge community around it, but there's one person kind of on that back end, and he really needs more people. There's also, I think, the threat of the publisher walled gardens. I talked about what Elsevier and Nature Springer are starting to do, and I have some concerns about that. Right now, it's presented as open, it's presented as enhancing the research, it's presented as accessible. I'm concerned that if we put data sets into Mendeley, at some point they'll start charging us for access to them. Nature Springer's model is, pay us $300 to do metadata and curation, and I'm hesitant to turn that responsibility over to them when that is a job I think is better done in the library. And then we talked about, is the data reusable? Will anyone use it? If they can't find it, or it's bad data, or it's poorly done, it will go unused. It will not be usable, and your reputation will suffer because now you look like a bad researcher. You don't even share good data. But there are opportunities. We're seeing a variety of models, how we can maintain and work together, and Bob's going to talk about that more. The models around the different repositories and the interest in making sure things are open and accessible to the broadest community possible. There's all those new opportunities for collaboration. We're working towards the FAIR model, the accessible and interoperable model, so that we keep those principles in mind. And they're very squishy principles if you looked at the FAIR model. it's really squishy. They're like, well, does this mean this? But they're deliberately so that we can work towards best practices together across disciplines. And it's not just this only works for this discipline. And we are seeing that funders are seeing the value. Last week, the National Science Foundation put out a Bridging the Gap statement, and it was talking about the need to fund long-term infrastructure, not just what's shiny and new, but the things that will sustain us in the future so that we can build the infrastructure and can do long-term retention, preservation, and sharing. And I think that's really encouraging. There are also the questions about equity. And I think the biggest one is who gets to participate. Right now, data repositories are North America and Europe. It looks white. It looks very rich. And that raises all of these questions of who gets to participate. If it's a data repository where users get to submit and you see community users submitting and aggregating and working on the data, who is given time to work on that? It's the same questions we see around Wikipedia. Who has the time and the luxury to spend time being an editor? And how do we prevent the same models that restrict access from playing out again in our data repositories? What institutions can participate? I talked about institutional repositories, but there are many universities that don't have one yet. So how do we make it equitable so that they have a place to submit data? And we're not saying, oh, well, just put it in this non-existent place that you don't have. Or you can only do research if you have an institutional repository. I mentioned the geographic regions, but also the reliance that we see on English is also a problem and a question of equity. If we're only saying we will accept this if you submit it to us and the abstract is in English, we're limiting who can submit, who can work with us. I think we are moving away, or one of the goals, I think, in thinking about equity is to move away from the gift culture of data. And I pull this from a Wallace Borgman article. And while Bob is talking, I'll go find that citation. They talk about the gift culture and where it is that when you come into the community, you are gifted data. Here's a little piece of data, you write about that, and now you are part of the community. Well, that assumes that there's somebody to give you that first piece of data. And data repositories can remove that barrier if they're done well. We can improve equity there. I think there are opportunities to share costs and workloads so that we stop all doing the same thing. And we've seen that, we're starting to see that between some of the institutions. And there are also ongoing ethical questions about the data that we preserve, who gets access to it, what parameters under which they get access, how long we keep that data, whether we are harming people or harming locations by preserving data or making it available. So there are more questions than I have answers. All right, so now I will turn it over to Bob to talk about sustainability in action.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to talk about the challenges of sustaining a successful research data repository ecosystem in what's a rapidly changing landscape. I'm going to refer to DataOne as a case study. As I was mentioning earlier, I was a co-investigator during the first 5 years of the project, 2009 through 2014. I've remained involved with the project since then. And I'm currently one of the co-chairs of the DataOne users group, along with Carl Benedict from the University of New Mexico Library. I'm also currently a member of the DataOne transition and leadership teams, which are focused on how to transition DataOne from relying on a relatively high level of National Science Foundation funding to a more mixed blend of funding, and transition from a project driven by milestones to one that's really an engaged participatory global community that's responsible for decision making. So in the 1990s and the 2000s, research data repositories existed, but they were siloed. There were enormous cultural barriers to describing, sharing, and reusing data. Among these were a general lack of knowledge of metadata standards and their use, a lack of rewards to researchers for describing or sharing their data by depositing it in a repository, and a lack of tools to discover data across many repositories. Standards and practices for citing data sets didn't exist either. Most data reuse occurred through personal contact between researchers and people just, say, emailing someone to ask for a data set. The National Institutes of Health released its statement on sharing research data in 2003, but it was less than a mandate and pertained only to a subset of research funding in the US. NSF's work on cyber infrastructure and increased attention to data-driven science, scientific science, and model development for large-scale natural systems led to the realization within NSF that the data from research projects they funded were not being retained. That those data were valuable, and much data could not be regenerated without excessive cost, or simply it was unable to be recollected because it was observational in nature. And so this led to the release of the DataNet program solicitation in 2007. NSF sought projects that would be broad efforts to advance the arts of data acquisition, description, access, reuse, and with a preservation horizon of several decades. They also sought projects that would work to bring about the cultural changes required to motivate researchers to integrate research data management into their practices. And they also wanted improvements in the cyber infrastructure for repositories and the tools used by researchers. DataOne was one of two projects funded by NSF in 2009 in the first round of the NSF DataNet program. The initial funding was for 5 years, and the project was funded for a second 5 years at a lower level through 2019. NSF required that people with expertise in library and information science or archival science be integrated into the proposals. DataOne co-investigators and co-PIs included researchers from the University of Tennessee Knoxville School of Information Sciences, as well as practitioners from UIC and California Digital Library. DataOne stands for Data Observation Network for Earth, and aimed to build an interoperable data preservation and access network to facilitate discovery, access, and reuse of Earth observational data. By federating access to data from many disciplines, gathered at many scales and with diverse methods, it promised to help researchers address grand challenges such as biodiversity loss and climate change. DataOne was needed because it was and remains incredibly difficult to find existing data to reuse for research. The data that you may find can be difficult to interpret and reuse, and the availability of data is required for the replication of results, which is a fundamental element of the scientific method. Today, DataOne is a global network of 40 science data repositories. There are participating repositories in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North and South America. The primary focal areas are earth and environmental sciences, but some repositories with complementary data do participate, such as the Minnesota Population Center and the Digital Archaeological Record. A couple of repositories that participate that were mentioned by Abigail include California Digital Library's Merit Repository and Dryad. Disciplines and types of data covered include things from marine geoscience and species distribution data to data from ecological monitoring stations that's been collected over a long period of time, oceanic topography, registries of physical samples, human population data, archaeological data, data taken from satellite observatories and sensor networks. There's also data that's been derived from other data, and data associated with papers published by many societies and publishers, and that's the kind of data that Dryad contributes. One way that the project facilitated cultural change was creating, publicizing, and easy to understand representation of data lifecycle. The cyber infrastructure team then worked to develop or co-develop tools that related to each step in the data lifecycle, including metadata editors, extensions to tools for researchers such as R and MATLAB, contributing to the development of the DMP tool, and integrating DataOne search results with citation management systems. DataOne repositories communicate with central DataOne services when they have new data to be indexed. Interactions between the member repositories and the central services utilize the DataOne API. The metadata created by the scientists is kept intact within the central services. Metadata required for indexing is extracted and stored separately, and new metadata, referred to as system metadata, is created to help DataOne coordinate services such as access control and data file replication for preservation. The search interface is shown here is powerful and supports features and facets such as a map-driven bounding box, search by specific data attributes, limits results to those results containing data files, and limits by member repository, creator, year, DOI, taxon, or location. As a federated search system, DataOne provides users with access to data from multiple repositories and disciplines. And as with all federated search systems, the search capabilities at the native repository interface may be more feature-rich. DataOne also supports a variety of metadata standards on ingest, and these include FGDC, the Federal Geographic Data Committee recommendation, EML, the Ecological Metadata Language, NetCDF, which is the Network Common Data Form, Dublin Core, Darwin Core, and ISO geospatial metadata. The DataOne infrastructure supports the definition of relationships between data sets, scripts, and outputs through its data provenance features. This image shows that 4 data files represented by the, I'm trying to get the pointer to work. That's right here. Does that work? There we go. 4 data files represented by the grid icons on the left were integrated to create a new data file, which was then submitted to a script. And that's over here, represented by that arrow containing the angle bracket icon on the right to create 2 images that are maps of the Gulf of Alaska. These relationships between data files, scripts, and outputs are represented internally by OAI, ORE resource maps. DataOne's also worked on support for the semantic description of data down to the level of individual observations, but that work is still under development. The project has had a robust assessment program as well. There's been 3 surveys of scientist attitudes and practices around data management that have been conducted at 3 distinct points in time. 2 of these surveys have been summarized in papers published in PLOS One. The 3rd manuscript is forthcoming. And several surveys of both libraries and librarians have been done in the US and Canada. And then in a separate project, European research libraries were surveyed. These surveys have also been adapted and rerun in other countries by other researchers. The project has also conducted regular usability testing of tools, including DataOne Search. The community engagement arm of DataOne has conducted more than 30 webinars since 2015, covering all phases of the data lifecycle. If you do a search for the phrase DataOne webinars, you'll see what's available and be able to view the recordings and related online discussions. Webinar topics have included data and metadata quality, software carpentry, provenance, reproducibility, fair data, open science, and the management of qualitative data. The community engagement folks have also trained more than 5,000 people in data management, and these are primarily domain scientists and students attending face-to-face workshops frequently at society meetings. The project has created 10 widely used education modules, which have now been migrated to GitHub to enable community maintenance of the content. In addition, the project created a popular librarian outreach kit. DataOne has funded 60 summer interns who have worked on projects with data from both the cyber infrastructure and community engagement sides of the project. The DataOne community engagement arm is also responsible for creating and maintaining general marketing and outreach materials and social media channels. And community engagement folks have also helped facilitate the work of the DataOne users group. So DataOne and its contributing repositories contain about 1.2 million data files, and which uses about 48 terabytes of storage. The temporal coverage of the data spans from the early 19th century to the present, and the geographic coverage is truly global, and data are contributed from many disciplines. Data have been contributed by about 143,000 individuals, and there have been nearly 30 million downloads of data files and metadata records since DataOne became operational in mid-2012. The Federation is continuing to grow with several more repositories in test mode now. Those include AIDA EarthChem Repository, CYBERS, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, and the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, which is an interesting new project because Cary Institute is running a share for institutions. So the long-term sustainability of DataOne is a major focus within the project now, and there are a bunch of factors to consider. First, NSF won't pay to sustain infrastructure for the long run, so DataOne needs to develop and maintain a diverse set of consistent funding streams. And this is also a challenge that many of the other US-based member repositories are facing, these kind of time limits to NSF funding. Second, competition has risen since 2009 from the commercial entities like Bigshare, Elsevier, and Google, as well as other sources such as data.gov in the US. And Abigail talked about much of that competitive landscape earlier. So many of the barriers I referenced at the beginning of my section have been reduced in scale, but none of them have been completely eliminated. Significant numbers of scientists are yet still untrained with regard to describing, sharing, and reusing data, and some scientists are still unwilling to do it at all. While the DataOne scientist surveys indicate that more scientists are aware of metadata standards and the value of metadata, there has not yet been a reduction in the number of standards in use. Many scientists still use custom metadata schemes developed in their labs, or no standards at all. You can dive into those trends by looking at the scientist survey papers published by Carol Tennefer and colleagues in PLOS One. The ability to easily demonstrate the value of well-described, accessible data still eludes us, despite more journals providing guidance to authors about submitting research data with their manuscripts, and even of organizations like DataCite and Oregon. Good practices by researchers are simply not yet widely recognized. Researchers generally don't properly cite the data they use or the repositories where they find the data. Lack of compliance with citation guidelines by scientists then makes it more difficult for individual repositories or aggregators like DataOne to demonstrate their impact on scientific practice and thus their contributions to new discoveries. There's some good news on the metrics front. DataOne has been a partner in the Make Data Count project, which is a partnership between the California Digital Library, DataCite, and DataOne. DataOne announced yesterday the availability of new data usage and citation metrics on the DataOne search and discovery system, which is at search.dataone.org. Counts for citations, downloads, and views are now presented along with the object's metadata. When citations from papers to a data set are available, you can link to the paper citing the data directly from the DataOne search results. And all of these metrics are counter compliant. It's easy to get people to agree with normative statements like, we need trustworthy repositories. Data must be well described with standard metadata and augmented with semantics and ontologies. Data should be easy to find, understand, and reuse. Data must be preserved to enable future discoveries. We need to record the provenance of research data. Replicability of science depends on well-preserved, accessible data. And we want excellent metrics on data and repository use, downloads, and data reuse. But providing these services for lots of data has significant costs, including the infrastructure, the servers, storage, and networking, as well as the people required to maintain and improve the infrastructure. We need new tools to support ingest, curation, and preservation. We need people to perform curation. There's also demand for improved tools to help researchers grapple with reuse data and to help them ensure their research is replicable. There's also continued demand for training, engagement, and outreach, including from data librarians to local faculty and students. DataOne is interviewing people from a range of stakeholder groups to learn about what, after several years of experience, these stakeholders value most about DataOne and what is most important for DataOne to focus on in the future. Repository managers have several concerns. For one thing, it takes a lot of human work, mostly programmer time, to connect a repository to the DataOne Federation using the existing APIs. DataOne is working to implement data ingest using schema.org, which is what Google is using to harvest data for dataset search. This will significantly reduce the cost to repositories for contributing their data to DataOne. But we're not sure about some other needs for repository managers, researchers, and librarians. Some questions we have include, is the federated search DataOne provides important? Is the preservation of data important to repositories that are concerned about their own sustainability? Is the size and scope of the holdings in DataOne limiting the usefulness of the federated search? Is data discovery less important now that Google provides data search? How can DataOne improve and increase the value of the metrics we provide to repositories about how their data is discovered, accessed, and reused? And what can be done to make it easier for researchers to deposit data and create high-quality metadata? For college and university administrators, we want to know what features of DataOne might provide good institutional value at a reasonable cost. Earlier, Abigail talked about institutions without a repository being at a disadvantage with regard to data management. So, would institutions be interested in a branded deposit and discovery interface with usage statistics returned to the organization about their researchers' deposits, citations, and downloads? And more generally, should the Academy, and is the Academy able to, own and operate the core infrastructure to manage its research data? And does DataOne have a role as part of that core infrastructure going forward? And for funders, would they want a way to systematically catalog all the data sets generated by the projects they've funded and track their impact through citation and download statistics? And would funders want services to help monitor compliance with their own research data management mandates? And now some final comments about the road ahead for DataOne. So DataOne has been successful in many ways. It's federated the holdings of 40 data repositories from around the world, which constitutes a collection of more than 1.2 data files. And it's been a leader in raising awareness and improving data practices across the data lifecycle for researchers, data managers, and data librarians. And it's contributed to many related projects like Make Data Count, and developed innovations like research data provenance. But changes are required. In about a year, DataOne will transition from being a milestone-driven project with significant community participation to a fully open, engaged, and participatory global community that sets the agenda for DataOne. This is an enormous cultural and organizational change, And librarians and libraries have a huge role to play in that transition. This transition will also affect data repositories, both those now contributing data to the DataOne Federation and those not yet participating. Institutions funding research will be affected, as will publishers and research institutions interested in measuring their collective scientific impact and compliance with mandates. Again, referring to Abigail's presentation and thinking about who gets to participate in the future. The current mechanism for community participation and engagement for DataOne is the DataOne Users Group. It was formed in 2010, and membership has grown to just over 500 people this year. Members of the DataOne Users Group are individuals, not organizations. And librarians have always been a significant proportion of the DataOne Users Group membership. Librarians have served as members of the DataOne Users Group Steering Committee, and librarians have often held one or both of the co-chair positions as they do now. Watch for news about the 2019 DataOne Users Group meeting, which will be held in conjunction with the Earth Sciences Information Partners meeting next summer. And if you're in the neighborhood, please consider attending and talking to us. There's never a registration fee for attending that meeting. The DataOne Users Group itself will be transforming into a different entity with a new name. It will likely provide structure for decision-making about priorities, roadmaps, and strategy for DataOne, and ensure that these decisions are made by all of the constituents of the contemporary data landscape. And now I think we have some time for questions.
Okay, and I saw Rebecca's question as Bob was speaking. She asked, is there training available on applying data standards such as Darwin Core? Many people have heard of them, but explaining and applying is more of a challenge. There's not a robust, here is how you do this, like step-by-step training that I have seen. There are bits and pieces for different standards that I've seen. Sometimes you'll get into a specific one that goes with a specific repository. They'll say, this is this repository, and here is how you do it. I think it's a gap in our training. And I could see something like data carpentry picking up lessons or creating something like that to move towards having more open education available. So if anyone wants to pitch that as a ALA presentation or as an RDAP presentation next year, I would really love to see that, because I would love to attend that workshop.
And I'll add that a lot of the training that DataOne has contributed to over the last 8 or 9 years has been aimed at scientists and students, and a lot of that is about how to work with metadata. I don't know that they've covered Darwin Core, and a lot of those presentations have been at society meetings like AGU and ESA. And ESA for sure is going to probably be focused on EML. But there's certainly, based on the results of our scientist survey, a great need for that. And quite a bit of that will probably be based on which disciplines and what they prefer as their metadata standards.
Yes, and Stefan commented that we're seeing a proliferation of OA, APC-driven data papers, which is basically data documentation, because we don't have a good way to acknowledge data as the scholarly object in and of itself. I'm not sure that the data papers are a bad thing. I think they could be, like, if that's how you're presenting that material and getting me to the data, that would be great. But yes, that is a concern, that it will be another thing that is packaged, processed, and more ways that our work is sold back to us. Obviously, I have strong opinions about that. Are there any other questions, Bob, or I could answer today? All right. Well, seeing no other questions, our email addresses are on the screen. So if you have a question that comes up later, we hope that you'll reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer questions about open data repositories, where we see things going, or anything else about DataOne. And I will hand it back to Margot.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks so much, Abigail and Bob, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. We will share the link to the recording shortly, so please keep an eye out for that. And thanks again for joining us.
Happy Open Access Week.